A simple slice of bread tossed onto a backyard lawn can accidentally reconstruct the entire brutal hierarchy of nature right outside your kitchen window. An observer named Mustafa Sajjad Haider documented exactly this in a journal entry in May of 2026. He started throwing bread out of his kitchen window for the small birds in his neighborhood. At first, sparrows and robins arrived, filling the yard with birdsong and activity. Then came the magpies, and the smaller birds vanished almost immediately. Pigeons eventually arrived in large numbers, forcing the few remaining magpies to huddle in the corners. Crows showed up next, pushing the pigeons aside with absolute dominance. Finally, neighborhood cats began patrolling the yard, and the bread simply sat there untouched while the birds watched helplessly from the rooftops. Mustafa concluded that his backyard had become a live demonstration of the survival of the fittest, which sent him into a philosophical spiral about whether human society operates exactly the same way.
That backyard progression is a textbook example of interference competition. When resources are centralized, like a pile of bread in an open space, it inevitably favors the largest, most aggressive participants. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology actually ran a massive, continent-wide study on this through a program called Project Feeder Watch. Researchers, including Elliot Miller, analyzed nearly 100,000 interactions at bird feeders across North America. They found that this dominance hierarchy is incredibly predictable and deeply entrenched. In almost every case, body mass dictates who eats and who starves. The American crow sits near the very top of that hierarchy, casually pushing out smaller birds like chickadees and sparrows. The smaller birds are forced to change their schedules, forage in less optimal areas, or simply go hungry.
Mustafa saw that exact dynamic playing out and immediately linked it to the phrase, survival of the fittest. He questioned whether the weak are inherently designed to be pushed aside by the strong. There is a deeply ingrained assumption that this ruthless, brute force competition is the core engine of biology laid down by Charles Darwin. The logic seems to be that if nature rewards the heavy-handed crows and punishes the fragile sparrows, then human society is simply following a biological imperative when wealth and power concentrate at the very top.
We have to dismantle that assumption entirely because attributing the phrase survival of the fittest to Charles Darwin is historically inaccurate. Darwin did not coin that phrase in his original 1859 publication of On the Origin of Species. The philosopher Herbert Spencer invented it in his 1864 book Principles of Biology. Spencer read Darwin's work on natural selection and immediately warped it to fit his own economic and social theories. Darwin was talking about reproductive success and an organism's ability to adapt to a specific, changing environment. Spencer turned it into a rigid moral justification for unbridled capitalism and social hierarchy. He argued that the wealthy were naturally superior and the poor were biologically inferior, which fundamentally changed how the public understood evolution.
That distinction is absolutely critical to this conversation. Darwin was describing a fluid ecological mechanism, while Spencer was trying to build an inflexible sociological rulebook. Spencer essentially argued that any legislation helping the poor, like providing health care or education, was a violation of natural law because it kept the unfit alive. He provided the intellectual foundation for social Darwinism, a philosophy that removes all ethical considerations from human suffering by framing it as natural.
And that foundation became the justification for some of the most horrific policies of the late 19th and 20th centuries. It fueled the eugenics movement, which Darwin's own cousin, Francis Galton, helped popularize in London. Leaders of industry used Spencer's philosophy as an excuse to relentlessly exploit workers, claiming that immense wealth inequality was merely nature taking its course. It is a fundamental misreading of ecology. In nature, fitness does not mean being the biggest or the most aggressive. A tiny Carolina chickadee is perfectly fit for its specific ecological niche. It survives winter by remembering thousands of different hiding spots for seeds. The problem only arises when you force the chickadee and the crow to compete for a single, unnatural pile of bread on a lawn.
The bread is the artificial constraint in this scenario. Mustafa fed the birds with genuinely good intentions, but he created an artificial scarcity by putting all the resources in one easily monopolizable spot. That is what triggered the violent hierarchy. He then extrapolated that to humans, asking a very dark question in his journal. If the weak birds are pushed away from the bread, where do they go? Do they find food elsewhere? And if they do, he asks, do weak humans find food elsewhere, or are they just barely surviving? He recognized the cruelty of the system and immediately felt overwhelmed by the implications.
His observation about the smaller birds surviving elsewhere is astute, but it misses the immense toll that displacement takes on an organism. Studies on urban avifauna show that when subordinate species are constantly chased away from high-quality food sources by dominant birds, they experience severe chronic stress. They burn far more calories searching for marginal food sources. They have fewer offspring, and their mortality rates climb. They survive, but they do not thrive in any meaningful sense. When we map that onto human society, the parallels to systemic poverty are glaring. People displaced by economic forces do not just disappear, they are pushed into resource deserts. They experience higher rates of chronic illness, shorter life expectancies, and immense psychological strain. They are surviving on the fringes, just like the sparrows watching the crows eat the bread.
Which brings us to the cats in Mustafa's story. The cats represent a completely different level of systemic threat. When the cats arrived, all the birds, regardless of their place in the avian hierarchy, were forced to the rooftops. The game ended entirely. The resources remained untouched because the threat of lethal violence overshadowed the fundamental need to eat. This shifts the dynamic from a competition for resources to outright terror.
That introduces the concept of the landscape of fear, a very real and documented ecological dynamic. When a predator is present, prey animals alter their behavior completely. They stop foraging, they abandon high-quality habitats, and they expend massive amounts of energy just staying alert. The cats didn't even need to physically attack the birds to control the yard. Their mere presence shut down the entire ecosystem. In human terms, this is directly comparable to authoritarianism or extreme systemic violence, where basic survival supersedes any economic or social ambition. The intricate hierarchy of the crows and pigeons dissolves entirely when a structural threat makes the very environment uninhabitable for everyone.
Mustafa reached a point in his journaling where his brain simply could not handle the weight of these realizations. He wrote that his head started hurting, and he decided the best course of action was to close his eyes and go to sleep. He chose willful ignorance because the alternative, confronting the harsh reality that the world is structured to reward the powerful at the severe expense of the vulnerable, was simply too painful to process in one sitting.
That psychological reaction is incredibly common and well documented. It is a form of compassion fatigue mixed with systemic paralysis. When an individual recognizes a massive, deeply entrenched problem, whether it is ecological collapse, global wealth inequality, or authoritarianism, the brain often shuts down as a protective mechanism. The scale of the issue makes any individual action, like throwing bread out a window, feel entirely futile or even counterproductive. Mustafa realized his simple act of charity had only fueled a brutal caste system in his backyard, and the guilt and helplessness drove him to look away.
But looking away allows the cats to keep patrolling and the crows to keep hoarding. The fatal flaw in Spencer's social Darwinism and in Mustafa's pessimistic conclusion is the assumption that cutthroat competition is the only natural force. If we look closer at biology, cooperation is just as powerful an evolutionary driver, if not more so.
That is the perfect counterargument to the survival of the fittest myth. We often ignore mutualism in favor of competition because conflict is louder and more visible. We see this play out even at bird feeders. Biologists at Carleton University who analyzed the feeder watch data found that highly social birds like pine siskins actually perform better in conflicts when they arrive in groups. Conversely, lone wolves like northern cardinals struggle more when faced with organized groups. The siskins use their social bonds to counter the brute strength of larger solitary birds. Sociality is an evolutionary adaptation, just as much as a sharp beak or a heavy body mass.
They essentially form a union to push back against the monopolists who want to hoard the bread.
In a biological sense, they do. Human beings are the ultimate social species. Our entire evolutionary advantage is based on our capacity for complex cooperation, language, and shared resource management. We are not doomed to operate like crows fighting over a slice of bread. We have the cognitive ability to recognize interference competition and actively build systems that prevent it. We can create laws, social safety nets, and equitable distribution networks. We can choose not to centralize all the resources in one vulnerable spot.
The tragedy of Mustafa's story is that he stopped observing too early. He saw the initial violence of resource centralization and assumed it was an unbreakable law of the universe. He failed to see that he, as the human throwing the bread, had the power to fundamentally change the parameters of the environment. He could have scattered the food across a wider area, forcing the crows to disperse and giving the sparrows a fair chance to eat without conflict.
By altering the distribution method, you completely change the ecological outcomes. The exact same principle applies to human economics and social policy. If you design a system that rewards resource hoarding and centralizes wealth, you will get a society of crows and cats. If you design a system that prioritizes decentralized access and mutual aid, you get a much more diverse, cooperative, and resilient ecosystem. We're not passive observers trapped in the universe's machinery. We are the architects of our own social environments.
We have to resist the urge to close our eyes and go to sleep when the system seems too cruel to fix. Acknowledging the brutality of a centralized hierarchy is the necessary first step toward redesigning it. The next time you look out your window and see the powerful dominating the weak, do not accept it as an inevitable law of nature. Question the environment that allows that domination to happen, and then figure out how to scatter the bread. Share this conversation with someone who needs a reminder that the rules of the backyard can always be rewritten.